Why time feels faster. As you age, Kant's mind-bending idea. You are 35 years old and summer just ended. You could have sworn it started 3 weeks ago. You are 45 and an entire decade passed while you were dealing with something you can no longer clearly remember. You are 50 and you have started to notice that the people who seem most alive are not the youngest people in the room. They are the people who seem most surprised by things. Nobody told you that time would do this. Everyone warned you about money, about health, about relationships. Nobody sat you down and said, there will come a point when the years start disappearing faster than the weeks did when you were young. And you will not understand why. And the not understanding will make it worse. Immanuel Kant had a theory about this, and it is one of the most disturbing ideas he ever proposed, not because it is depressing, but because once you understand it, you cannot ununderstand it. You will see it happening in real time, in other people, in yourself, and you will have to decide what to do about it. The theory starts here. Time is not a thing that exists in the world. I want you to pause on that for a second, because most of us go through our lives assuming that time is something out there, something the universe runs on like a kind of cosmic rail. Clocks measure it, calendars track it, physics equations contain it. Kant said, no, time is not a feature of reality. Time is a feature of you. It is the structure your mind uses to organize experience. Without a mind perceiving, there is no before or after. There is no sequence. There is no duration. There is only whatever it is that exists without a perceiver, which is not time. If you're the kind of person who finds that idea either fascinating or slightly nauseating, you're probably someone this channel was made for. The subscribe button is right there. We cover ideas like this every week for people who think too much. Now, back to the disturbing part. Kant identified two forms through which experience becomes possible. Outer sense, which organizes things in space, although it is extended, located at a distance from one another, and inner sense, which organizes states in time as sequential, as having before and after, as constituting duration. Space is how your mind organizes things out there. Time is how your mind organizes states in here, including your own mental states, including your memories, including your sense of yourself as a being with a past and a future. And this means something precise about the acceleration problem. When you feel time speeding up, what is actually changing is not time. Time, in Kant's framework, is the form of inner experience, not its content. What is changing is the density of distinguishable inner states. The rate at which your mind produces genuinely new experiences, ones it cannot simply match to an existing template and file away. If time is a structure your mind imposes on experience, what happens when experience stops changing? Think about your average Tuesday. Not a special Tuesday, an ordinary Tuesday in the middle of a stable period. Can you remember it? What you thought about, what you noticed, what surprised you? Probably not. And here is what Kant would say: a Tuesday that cannot be distinguished from the Tuesday before it leaves no trace. Your mind has no reason to store it as a separate event. It was not a new configuration of experience. It was a repetition of a pattern already filed away. You did not lose that Tuesday. You never had it in the first place. And that is where the acceleration begins. A mind that processes without producing new distinctions experiences very few storable inner states. Not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening does not meet the threshold required for the inner sense to register it as new. The pattern recognition machinery fires, matches the incoming experience to an existing template, and moves on. There is no arrest, no moment of genuine processing, and therefore no memory worth the name. You have felt this. You have had conversations that left no trace. Not because you were distracted, but because the conversation covered territory so familiar that your mind treated it as background rather than event. You have driven routes so habitual that you arrived with no conscious memory of the journey. You have eaten meals while thinking about something else, not because the meal was bad, but because the meal was indistinguishable from every previous version of that meal. None of those experiences were logged as distinct events. They were processed as pattern matches, and pattern-matched experience does not extend your felt life, it compresses it. Your memory does not record duration, it records events, distinct, storable, differentiated events. When you were 7 years old, every summer was infinite, not because the sun moved slower, but because everything that happened was new. New social dynamics, new physical sensations, new emotional textures you had never encountered before. Your mind was archiving constantly. Each day was a distinct file. Looking back, the summers felt long because they were dense with stored experience. Now consider what happens to a life built almost entirely on routine. Not a bad life necessarily, a comfortable life, a predictable life, the same commute, the same conversations, the same sequences, the same fears managed in the same ways. The mind recognizes the pattern immediately. There is nothing new to store, and so the days begin to blur, not because they were empty, because they were identical. The blurring is not a failure of memory, it is memory working correctly. Memory compresses repeated patterns. It saves the template and discards the duplicates. And here is the brutal part of this. You compress your own life when you stop making it strange enough to remember. Now I want to introduce a distinction Kant would have recognized, though he would have said it differently. The distinction is between living in time and living through time. Living in time is passive. You are carried. You show up, you respond, you maintain. Days happen. Seasons happen. Years happen. You are not absent exactly, but you are not the author of the experience either. You are a passenger watching the landscape move. Living through time is something else. It requires friction, novelty, genuine encounter with things that do not fit the existing pattern, not thrill-seeking, not chaos. Friction, specifically. The productive resistance of something new entering a mind that has to actually work to make sense of it. The people who report that their 40s felt slower than their 30s are almost always people who introduced serious friction into their 40s. A new project, a difficult skill, an honest conversation they had been avoiding for years. Not because those things were pleasant, because they were new enough to be stored. Kant himself is one of the stranger examples of this principle in action. He did not publish the Critique of Pure Reason until he was 57 years old. Think about that age for a moment. Most people in the 18th century were elderly by 57. Kant had colleagues who spent decades waiting for him to produce something significant. Students who respected him but quietly assumed the great work was not coming. He taught lectures for years, wrote minor essays, corresponded with other thinkers, and from the outside it must have looked like the slow passage of a competent but unremarkable career. Then, between the ages of 57 and 66, he published 3 of the most consequential books in the history of Western philosophy: the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, the Critique of Judgment. The architecture of modern thought built in a decade by a man most people had already written off. When asked in his later years about those final decades, his accounts were not those of a man who felt time slipping away. They were the accounts of a man for whom each year had weight and texture, because each year contained something genuinely new. A new problem being pressed against, a new formulation being tested and discarded, a new layer of the idea revealing itself and requiring him to revise everything above it. He was not young. He was not restless. He was not chasing novelty for its own sake. He was in genuine, sustained contact with something difficult, And difficulty is, it turns out, one of the most powerful things you can introduce into a life that has grown too smooth. There is a phenomenon that psychologists have studied under various names, but which Kant anticipated with unusual precision: the peak experience problem. When human beings encounter something genuinely new, a piece of music they have never heard, a landscape they have never seen, a conversation that takes a direction they did not predict, time dilates. The experience is richer, the memory is denser, the subjective duration is longer, and when the same experience repeats, the same music, the same landscape, the same conversation with the same predictable structure, the duration contracts. Not because less time passes, because less is being stored. The mind recognizes the pattern, processes it efficiently, and moves on. Efficiency is the enemy of felt time. This is a strange thing to say in a culture that worships efficiency. We optimize, we remove friction at every opportunity, and then we wonder why the years feel like they are being stolen. They are not being stolen, they are being compressed by us, by our preference for the comfortable and familiar over the strange and demanding. I am not going to tell you to quit your job or move to a new city. That is the kind of advice that sounds exciting at 11 in the morning and becomes exhausting by 3 in the afternoon. What Kant's idea actually suggests is more precise than disruption. The unit of experience your mind stores is the novel distinction, the thing that did not fit, the moment that required actual processing because it could not be filed under an existing category, and those moments can be small: a conversation taken somewhere you have never taken it, a path that is not the usual path, a question you have been sitting with without actually answering, a skill approached seriously enough to feel stupid at it. What matters is not the size of the novelty. What matters is that it is real, that it creates something your mind has to work to file, that it cannot be processed as a variation of something already known. This is also why travel sometimes works and sometimes does not. Tourism is often optimized to minimize friction, uncomfortable parts removed, unpredictable parts managed. What remains is controlled novelty, new surfaces, same patterns. Many people return from expensive trips with a blur of photographs and a sense that time passed without landing. The trip that felt long, genuinely long, the way summers felt long at 7, was probably the one where something went wrong, where you got lost, where you had to figure something out in a language you did not speak, where the plan dissolved and you had to be present in a way that the plan had prevented. Difficulty is the architecture of felt time, not suffering. Difficulty, the productive friction of a mind meeting something it has not yet categorized. Here is the scenario I want you to hold in your mind. 2 people, same age, same decade, same general circumstances. One spent the decade maintaining, doing what was required, managing the existing relationships, the existing responsibilities, the existing fears in the existing ways. Nothing dramatic happened. The decade was stable and comfortable. The other spent the decade in sustained contact with something genuinely difficult. Not a crisis, a project. Something that required learning. Something that was wrong several times before it was right. Something that kept producing new problems as the earlier problems were solved. Ask both of them at the end how the decade felt. The first, it went fast. They can name major external events, but they are vague about what they actually thought and felt during most of it. The decade exists as a general texture, not a sequence. It is compressed, already receding. The second, it felt long, not exhausting, full, dense. They can recall specific moments of genuine confusion followed by genuine clarity. The point where the whole approach had to change and why, and what that felt like. The decade exists as a populated landscape. It has mass. Same clock time. Completely different felt time, and the difference is not talent or circumstance, it is whether genuine novelty was encountered, whether the inner sense had real material to work with. This is also why grief does something strange to time. People who have lost someone significant often report that the period immediately following the loss felt very long, months that seemed like years, which is counterintuitive. We generally associate slow-feeling time with pleasant experience. But grief is a period of radical cognitive disruption. Everything familiar is suddenly wrong. Every pattern that assumed the person's presence now fails to complete. The mind is forced to produce new distinctions constantly. Nothing matches the existing model. Everything must be processed from scratch. The inner sense is working at maximum capacity, and the result is density. Duration. Memory that does not blur. Grief is terrible, but it is also dense. And the density is why it feels long. The felt reality of a period of time is not determined by whether it was pleasant. It is determined by whether it was full of storable, distinguishable experience. And the most reliable way to create that, without requiring catastrophe, is to stay in honest contact with difficulty. The people who age most slowly, in the subjective sense of the word, are not the people who avoid difficulty. They are the people who maintain a genuine relationship with it, who keep something hard in their life, who stay in contact with something they do not yet understand, who allow themselves to be confused regularly by something worth being confused by. Kant walked the same route every day for decades. His neighbors could set their clocks by him. His life, from the outside, looked like the definition of repetitive. And yet by his own account, and by the account of the people who knew him, it did not feel repetitive. Because the external routine was the scaffold for an internal life of sustained and serious engagement with ideas that refused to resolve easily, the walk was the same. The thinking was never the same, and I think that is the most useful thing to take from this. You do not need to blow up your external life to create internal density. You need to maintain honest contact with something that resists easy resolution, something that is actually difficult, something that is still unfinished. The worst thing you can do by this logic is to arrive, to decide that you have figured it out, to let your categories close and your patterns solidify, and your days start moving through you instead of you moving through them. The second worst thing is to confuse comfort with satisfaction. Comfort is the absence of friction. Satisfaction is the presence of something worth doing. They are not the same. And a life organized around comfort at the expense of satisfaction is a life that will compress. There is one more dimension to this, and it is the one most people avoid: self-knowledge. Kant was unusual in the specific claim he made about self-knowledge. He did not think it was easy. He thought it was the hardest form of knowledge available to a human being, harder, in some ways, than knowledge of the external world. When you try to examine yourself, you are using the instrument to examine the instrument, the inner sense trying to perceive the inner sense, which introduces a distortion that is very difficult to correct for. But he did not conclude that self-knowledge was therefore impossible or not worth pursuing. He concluded that it required the same sustained engagement that any serious inquiry requires. You cannot do it casually. You cannot do it in the margins of a busy week. It required the kind of attention that, when given honestly, changes what it examines. A life organized around avoidance of self-examination is a life that will feel fast, not because external events are moving quickly, but because the inner sense is being given nothing genuine to work with. The surfaces are being maintained, the patterns are being kept intact, and so there is nothing to store, nothing to remember, nothing that later constitutes felt duration. This connects directly to the time problem, because self-examination is, by definition, a source of genuine novelty. When you ask yourself an honest question, not the version of the question that already has a comfortable answer waiting. The inner sense has to work. It has to produce distinctions. It has to encounter something it did not already know how to file. And that work registers as time, as weight, as duration that can later be remembered. The people who report in old age that their lives felt rich, genuinely rich, not just full of pleasant events, are almost always people who stayed in honest contact with themselves throughout, who kept asking and kept waiting for the actual answer rather than the convenient one, who allowed the answer to change as they changed, who were surprised, sometimes uncomfortably, by what the honest examination produced. Before I leave you with this, I want to say something about regret. Some people hear an idea like this and feel something that resembles grief. Years already spent in routine. Decades of smooth, efficient, forgettable time. The compression has already happened and cannot be undone. Kant would not have a lot of patience for that particular emotion, and neither do I. He published the most important work of his life at 57. That is not a story about youth. It is a story about what happens when a mind stays in genuine contact with something difficult for long enough. The time before the publication was not wasted. It was the slow accumulation of understanding that made the publication possible. The years that looked like nothing from the outside were exactly as dense as the years that looked like everything. The question is not how much time has passed. The question is what the remaining time is going to be made of. You are not a passenger in your own life who happens to also be watching time pass. You are the perceiver through whom time becomes time, which means you have more influence over how time feels than any clock can measure. Make it strange enough to remember. Keep something genuinely difficult in your life. Stay in contact with something that is not yet resolved. Let yourself be confused by something worth being confused by, not because it will make you more productive, not because difficulty is a virtue in itself, but because the alternative, the smooth, efficient, comfortable, forgettable life, is a life that will compress. And you will wake up one morning and realize that the years passed while you were managing things. And management, it turns out, leaves very little for the inner sense to record. The stars still move above Königsberg. The walks still happen at the same hour. But the mind behind the walking, that mind was always somewhere else, always working, always in contact with something that had not yet resolved, always one question deeper than it had been the last time. That is how you make a life that, looking back, was not fast. That is how you make time you can actually keep.